It feels like there is very little common ground on most political and policy issues these days, but poverty could be an area where there's more consensus than you might think.
We can't just throw money at people or at policies and think that's going to solve things. That's because poverty is also a moral phenomenon, it's a social phenomenon, it's a cultural phenomenon, and it's a psychological phenomenon. It's something that scars people.
On this episode, we profile 7 common ground solutions to poverty that should reshape the debate over the health of the American dream. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about the American dream. We're going to do kind of a check-in on how it's doing today, and we're talking with some experts from the Illinois Policy Institute about work on poverty and upward mobility and how we make sure the American dream is more accessible to more Americans. And I want to introduce our guests. We're pleased to be joined today by Josh Bandoch, who's the head of policy for the Illinois Policy Institute, and Eddie Kornegay, who goes by Dr. K, who serves as the executive director for the Center for Poverty Solutions at the Illinois Policy Institute. Josh and Dr. K, thanks for being with us on Defending Ideas. So I want to start into this conversation with this question about the American dream, because to me, if you boil down what it means to be an American, the American experiment, the American way of life, in an oversimplistic kind of way, is really about 2 things. Number one, it's about protecting your essential rights, your civil liberties as guaranteed in the Constitution and our founding documents. But then number 2, it's about opportunity, upward mobility, that we're going to protect your rights and let you have the opportunity to build a better life for yourself. That's the essence of what America is. And you guys have done a tremendous amount of work on this idea of the American dream and upward mobility, focused on Illinois, but I think there's some really important takeaways for us here in Utah and across the country. And I want to start off and ask you kind of this broad question. Are we winning or losing the war on poverty today? What is the health of the American dream in your perspective?
I'm afraid that my initial response is that it's not looking so good. And so it's not looking so good for a couple of reasons. And I think you framed this in exactly the right terms, because America is different. It's a different nation because America is an idea. And like you said, that idea is founded in things like rights and our founding documents, the Declaration, the pursuit of happiness. And there is a survey that the Wall Street Journal took in November of 2023, so just a couple of months ago. And it asked participants if you believe in the American dream. And only 36% of respondents, barely more than 1 in 3, said that they do believe in the American dream. And that's down a lot over the last decade and a half. It was from well over 50% now down to a third. And if people don't believe in the American dream, which, like you said, it's all about opportunity. That's why we call America the land of opportunity. Then America ceases being an idea. And that is, I think, lethal to the American experiment and to American exceptionalism. So how does this relate to poverty? Well, if there are a lot of poor people in the land of opportunity and it's not getting better, then you wonder, is this really the land of opportunity? And if you look at both nationally and also in Chicago, because we're an Illinois-based think tank, the data on poverty, it doesn't look so good, at least the official poverty rate. So from before the war on poverty started in 1965 until today, the poverty rate has really hovered between 11 and 15%. It's fluctuated inside that range. Now, some people say, well, that doesn't account for wealth transfer programs, and that's true in a sense. And I think for me that's a little bit beside the point, because this core data indicates that in many ways, people's economic lives, especially what they do for themselves, isn't improving. In Chicago, it's actually even worse. The poverty rate in Chicago is 17.2%. That means that as I sit here in my apartment in Chicago, over 450,000 Chicagoans are suffering through poverty every day. And that rate is actually higher than it was before the war on poverty started.
Josh, I want to pinpoint something you said, and then Dr. K ask for your thoughts, because you bring some good perspective with sort of the on-the-ground work, and maybe can have a good sense of how people are feeling who are maybe feeling a little bit stuck or feeling a little bit hesitant to say that, yes, the American dream is alive and well. But But there's something that you mentioned, Josh, I want to pinpoint first, that how we even measure or define or talk about poverty has actually been a subject of debate over the years. And as you mentioned, that the official poverty rate that we've used for many, many years, a lot of folks criticize that, as you've mentioned, because they say, well, it doesn't account for, you called it wealth transfers. For our listeners, that's things like safety net programs, benefits from the government, maybe tax credits, things like that. Essentially, efforts that we have to alleviate the material suffering of folks who are stuck in poverty, that certain ways of defining and measuring poverty may not account for that. But I want to turn that into this bigger principled question, because I think this is actually at the core of this discussion today and in general, is that what is really the purpose of our anti-poverty work in this country? Is it to just alleviate material suffering? Or is it to help people get back on their feet such that they no longer need the assistance in the first place? And maybe, Dr. K, let's go to you. With your role running the Center for Poverty Solutions there at the Illinois Policy Institute, you kind of have a good sense of on the ground how people feel. What are they experiencing when they're trying to get out of poverty? What would you say from your work there? What is the hope? Is it, well, I'm glad to be in America because my needs are going to be taken care of, and that's what I want from government assistance? Or is it, I want to work, I want to get back on my feet and be self-sufficient? Give us a snapshot into what people on the ground are feeling and experiencing.
Well, thanks, Nick. I think that for me and what I understand and what I experience when I engage community-based organizations and employment social enterprises and faith-based organizations is that the American dream for many is a pathway to prospering in your purpose. And then too, when we think about how do you get there, and if the dignity of work is that number one thing that we use to provide ourselves with the capacities that we need to move ourselves and our families forward into the future, then the number one thing about poverty that I understand is that poverty is a lack of self-production. And as a lack of self-production, well, what are the things that get in the way and hinder people from the ability to actually produce for themselves? Understanding that, that is in fact an entrepreneurial endeavor, but even before you can get to an entrepreneurial endeavor and have a vision for that kind of prospering for yourself, you have to have in place mechanisms that allow for you to develop the enabling skills through solid employment that allow you to begin to move to a place where you can actually begin to activate on your dreams. And so I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think that we are in a position where I think we're reaching a threshold or an apex where people are really thinking through, well, what I have invested in to this point, to this date, politically and economically, and even ideologically, aren't meeting the demands that I want for my life. And so people are open to actually exploring new ways of thinking and shifting in culture, shifting their cultural competencies to actually begin to think about what it means to be an American, full stop. And I would say that many people that are impacted, poor people, if you will, have yet to actually experience being an American, full stop. And because of that, it limits the view that you have of what America can offer and no other country can offer like this. And so I think there's a lot of optimism on the ground, but we have to get to those pockets of optimism. And when we find those pockets of optimism, nurture them with the research, nurture them with the value propositions, nurture them with the optimism, I think, that comes with the movement that we're talking about, that we're doing in the work that's going on, like in Utah or here in the state of Illinois.
You mentioned this phrase, I wrote it down, pockets of optimism, and I really love that because I think between the two of you both captured it well, that there seems to be, it feels like there are so many reasons to be pessimistic today, that we say, well, Washington is broken, our politics are divisive, and elected officials are just bickering all the time, that there's, you just turn on the news, you look online, and it seems like it's so easy to just walk away with a sense of negativity about the big political and policy challenges we face today. But I want to pinpoint something, Dr. K, from your perspective, because you're you're pulling from your work with people actually in poverty who are trying to get out of poverty. And if you're walking away with a sense of optimism, that's very encouraging for the rest of us, because if those folks have this sense of, well, I still have hope in the American dream that it can be achieved, maybe the job for us just to kind of clear the path. And that comports a lot with what I've seen on the ground here in Utah in some work that I've done over the years on this issue is when you actually sit down and talk with people who are in poverty and trying to create a better life for themselves and their families. Without question, from my experience, the general attitude is, I want to get back on my feet. I want to work. I want to earn success, to use an Arthur Brooks term, and create a better life for my family. There's this deep desire for self-sufficiency, for upward mobility. I don't know what to call that other than optimism and hope. And it ties into what one of the things I want to talk to you both about today is this idea of, well, what do we do? How do we who work in the policy space help turn that optimism into actual earned success for these folks? And so Josh, maybe ask you to weigh in. What are you guys working on there in Illinois? What are some of the things that you've come out with that you think can help move the needle on this? And maybe a good place to start is your paper that we'll include in the show notes. It's called Common Ground Solutions to Empower Chicago's Poor, a Model for American Cities. There's a lot of really, really good stuff in here, but you also outline 7 what you call macro solutions to poverty that you say there's consensus around. Is there really consensus? Give us a sense of optimism that, yes, there's a lot of positive momentum, and we have a game plan.
So there actually is, for me, great cause for optimism. When I really started to dive into the poverty work, I just started looking from our friends over on the left, like Urban Institute, Progressive Policy Institute, Brookings, all the way to our friends on the right, Cato Institute, American Enterprise Institute. And I was really pleased to see that around a lot of issues, we are both observing the same things and we are pointing towards the same solutions. So the first answer is yes, there is cause for optimism. So kind of step back for a second. What are we trying to do? We're trying to provide persuasive, common sense model solutions. And I can unpack each of those things. And the whole goal of all of our poverty work on the ground with direct service providers and then in our research is empowerment. To empower people, especially the poor, to rise and unleash their potential. So I'm happy to dive into each area. In terms of like, what are these 7 solutions and how are they common sense? So the first one centers on the dignity of work. And it is centered on the notion that, yes, morally, that is where we get our dignity as human beings. At least a big part of it is work. And that work is a great way to solve poverty. Remember, I said that 17.2% of Chicagoans suffer through poverty every day. For those who work full-time year-round, it's 2.3%. So the data on that are, I think, crystal clear that if you work, you're not in poverty. We're interested in the future of work because it is possible that we could craft policies and workforce training programs and things like that that solve poverty today, only to see people fall back in poverty tomorrow. And if you're skeptical, look at the Rust Belt, places where people for 10, 15, 20 years had a job until they didn't. The third area that we focus on are barriers to work. So that would be things like occupational licensing or overregulations that make it hard or impossible for people to enter various industries. A third area that we're interested in is safety net reform, especially safety net policies, things like the benefits cliff that disincentivize people from working and from being empowered. We're also interested in education, both to ensure that every child gets a high quality education, because it's kind of hard to be empowered and work if you can't read and write. And that's a huge problem here in Chicago. And then also to shift towards a career-first model of education, which will empower people through things like apprenticeships and not only through a college degree. We also look at housing because everyone deserves a good roof over their heads. And if housing isn't affordable, and that's where most of your money goes, it's going to be really hard to rise out of poverty. And then the last thing that we're interested in is family structure. So there's this thing called the success sequence that Dr. K is way more articulate about than I am, which talks about how if you do 4 things in this order, you finish high school, get a full-time job, get married, and then have kids, your poverty rate is 2%. So do things in this order and poverty is dramatically reduced. So looking at policies that will at least remove disincentives and barriers to people following that sequence. So those are our macro solutions, and I get them not from me, but from looking at the folks over at Urban Institute and Brookings just as well as folks at AEI and Keto.
Dr. K, the things that Josh just outlined, which again, to me, they seem very resonant with, I'm glad, Josh, you framed it as consensus, that if you were, I would imagine, with relatively rare exception, if you were to walk into any room full of elected officials, public policy professionals, folks who care deeply about these kinds of issues, and say, hey, here are the things we're really focused on, with, again, maybe relatively rare exception, you would get a lot of welcome kind of receipt of those ideas. And the big themes that come out of those are work, education, safety net reform, and then the success sequence. I know the success sequence for some might come off as a little bit more controversial, which we can kind of dive into that. But Dr. K, those big themes, the idea of work and education and safety net reform, and then sort of your trajectory as a person in terms of how and when you form a family, what strikes you about those that is, I guess, is that the right set of ingredients for folks who are trying to get out of poverty? If we go to them with these ideas and say, here are the things that we think are the most powerful to help empower you to be successful in life, our job as policy professionals is to clear your path and make sure that you do not face obstacles to accomplishing these things. Is that the right approach, or is that missing anything for folks who are on the ground experiencing this?
Well, that's a great question, or set of questions, and I think it's the right approach. And I look at it like this, from the perspective of on the ground. The closer you get to the ground, the more the understanding and language experience of success changes. And in that change, success is more about survival. So it becomes success, it's a day-to-day thing. I made it through today. I'm successful. And then those things that make a person successful is they're able to meet immediate needs. They're able to meet critical needs. That means that they might have to find immediate needs. They have a little bit of food for the day. Critical need, say they come home and there's an eviction notice on their door, and they try to find a safety net, a resource to ameliorate that. Everyone wants to keep away from dire needs, and dire needs are those needs that end up, I think, challenging the critical thinking and decision making and choice outcomes of people, because now they're suffering at the level of their dignity. And so I think that these solutions are exceptional. I mean, people are looking for an answer, but haven't had as yet the opportunity to do that. And so when you present these opportunities to actually change your mind and change your culture at the level of community, they begin to resonate with people. And this is how you begin to clear the road, because now people know how to devote their values, vote for those people who will to champion what it is that they need, and look for the resources like a Policy Institute or a Sutherland Institute for the answers and the solutions to the problems that are persisting in their lives on the ground level, day to day.
Dr. K, you mentioned this idea of survival, and the way it's been described to me, in my personal life, I've never experienced extreme chronic poverty, and so I don't have that same level of understanding, on that kind of level of depth. But the way I had it described to me, this was in like a poverty training workshop a number of years ago. But this idea was for folks who maybe haven't experienced this, imagine how you feel, and this is a very, very rough analogy, so it's for sure an imperfect analogy, but the question was posed, imagine how you feel if you pull an all-nighter, and the next day, if you had zero sleep the night before, the next day, how do you feel? What's on your mind? What are kind of your focuses for the day? And I'm sure most, if probably all of us, and one point or another in our lives, school or kids or work deadlines or whatever, we've pulled all-nighters before. And the framing for that is that, well, in that situation, that next day, you're just thinking, I'm just too exhausted and too stressed. The only thing I can think about is can I get to the end of today? So that means I'm just going to grab a cheeseburger for lunch. I don't care. I'm just going to do what I need. Anything I put off till tomorrow, I will. I'm just going to focus on how do I get through the day and make sure the most important boxes are checked for today. So I guess my first question is that sort of the frame we need to put ourselves in when we're trying to understand how best to help folks escape poverty? And then do we couple that with, again, our job on the policy side is, maybe in some ways help address some of those immediate needs. And that's the purpose of stabilization, like safety net programs and those kinds of things. But then we're going to help make it a little easier for you to achieve these longer term things that we're talking about in terms of work and education credentials and family progression. Again, is that sort of a framework that you think would be compelling to individuals, Dr. K? And then Josh, I want to get your thoughts on, is that persuasive for other folks in the policy debate on this issue?
I think it's a perspective that is something that needs to be explored. I'm not saying that it's the solution of all solutions, but it's at least a starting point. And I think that's what we're doing here with the Center for Poverty Solutions and Illinois Policy Institute, is we're saying, hey, let's take this to the streets. Let's take it to the people. Let's take it to the organizations that are assisting them on the ground, and making and reducing the distance between thought and practice, bringing them together into really not just a think tank, but also an incubator, if you will. This is all of what it is that we're doing. This is new. Let's do it like this, and let's see where it heads. I think of two things. One is, and I'll paraphrase it, that optimism is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And so what we're doing is getting at the soul and the faith of people and communities. And what we're showing with the work that we're doing, that Josh is doing, and what the Policy Institute is doing, and what the Center for Poverty Solutions is doing, is showing people that we care. You're not just a data point. You're not just a problem to be solved, but there's the humanity of it is something that we're able to get to in what we do. And so I think it takes and makes practical and purposeful the work in such a way that these pockets of optimism that we find begin to flourish, because they're thinking differently, and they're thinking about America differently, and they're thinking about their possibilities for themselves and for the futures of their families a bit differently.
Josh, are we hitting the right notes from a policy persuasion standpoint? Is this on the right track?
I think this is on the right track. I guess a couple of things. One is that I think one thing we need to do is understand that poverty is not purely or even mainly an economic phenomenon, that we can't just throw money at people or at policies and think that's going to solve things. That's because poverty is also a moral phenomenon. It's a social phenomenon. It's a cultural phenomenon, and it's a psychological phenomenon. It's something that scars people. It's a part of my family history. My mom grew up poor. My grandmother raised 5 kids by herself. They were so poor, my grandmother had to count pennies. And my mom and her siblings wondered if there were going to be Christmas presents under the tree every year, and that's because most years there weren't. So it was real, and my mom bears those scars to this day, and I think it's really easy to overlook that and just focus on the data and the numbers. And I think that in terms of the persuasion standpoint, there are many things we need to do. We do the great research, and then we forget that there's an emotional component to communications, and we don't do a good job with that. There's a moral component to communications, and we don't do a good job with that. And there's a storytelling component to communications, and we don't do a good job with that. That's one thing that I think that our work is different and presents our opportunity, is that by working with real people on the ground, we get those stories, we see those things, and we can celebrate those stories of success. So I think that focusing on opportunity and empowerment and this sort of upbeat agenda is necessary because we need to be for people, and we need to have different messaging that brings people into our movement and motivates people to work with us. And I think there are a lot of ways that we don't get that right.
I want to go to a quick break, and when we come back, dive into some of the specific areas of reform that you guys have outlined before. But I want to mention one thing before we go to break, is that this idea, pulling off of what you just said, Josh, that one of the things I love about the work you all do overall, and in this case, some of the specific references in your paper that we're linking to in the show notes, is you primarily are making a moral argument. You're saying the fact that we have over 37 million Americans still in poverty right now is unjust, and the fact that that large swaths of Americans who don't believe in the American dream, that's unjust, it's immoral, it's wrong. There's still plenty of data to make an economic argument, but the leading message is this sort of moral case that can appeal to folks on a very human level, and I just love that framing, because obviously you need both. But you have to be able to articulate that there's just something wrong if so many people are stuck or feel stuck, and that's what we're trying to fix. So I really love that framing. Let's go to a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk through some of the details in your paper and in some of the work you were doing, talking about safety net reform, benefit cliffs in particular, and maybe sort of this idea of clearing the path, removing barriers to work, and just helping these folks feel like, hey, you got an open road in front of you. Now you can move forward, take advantage of those opportunities, and turn, again, those pockets of optimism into real, tangible, earned success for these families. So let's take a quick break. We're talking with Josh Bandoch and Eddie Kornegay from the Illinois Policy Institute. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and we're going to continue our conversation with Josh Bandoch and Eddie Kornegay of the Illinois Policy Institute and the Center for Poverty Solutions at Illinois Policy Institute, and talk about some ideas for reform, how we take the things we've talked about so far and really turn it into a movement that can actually have policy outcomes to benefit the lives of people on the margins of our society who are trying to work their way up and create a better life for themselves and their families. Before we jump back in, though, I want to mention, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to this podcast on any of the major platforms, Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Just search for Defending Ideas and click that subscribe button. If you like to watch your content, then you can subscribe to the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel, and make sure you click the little bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. You can access all of that and more at defendingideas.org. Josh and Dr. K, I want to pick up where we left off and really focus on ideas for reform. How do we improve some of our programs that, when we talk about, we led at the beginning with some commentary around the war on poverty, a lot of these programs that have been on the books now for decades. And I really believe that the vast majority of our anti-poverty efforts in this country are deeply well-intentioned. That they're from the standpoint of, we want to help people, we don't want people to be experiencing poverty, but public policy creates unintended consequences, and that means that we just need to tweak some things, reform some things, maybe significantly reform some things. And I want to lead off by pulling from a section of your paper, Josh, on these common sense, sort of consensus solutions to poverty, where you quote President Ronald Reagan. And from your paper, you write, President Ronald Reagan rightly remarked, "We should measure welfare success by how many people leave welfare, not by how many people are added." And then you say, the purpose of welfare, he insisted, needs to be to make our fellow citizens, quote, self-sustaining and, as quickly as possible, independent of welfare. And then in your paper, you say a safety net needs to be temporary unless someone is unable to work. So that framing, that the goal is to sort of get people off of these programs, but ensuring that we're sort of helping them get off these programs into actual careers where they can provide for their families. But sometimes it doesn't feel like that's what these programs do in practice for some folks. And I want to talk to you in particular. You mentioned one of the areas of reform is in the safety net, specifically in benefit cliffs. And so maybe, Josh, start with you. We've talked about it before on this show a few times, but give a little reminder for our listeners of what that challenge is and why it's so impactful.
So I think one thing to remember when we're looking at poverty and these issues is that poor people are smart and they respond to incentives. And unfortunately, we structure some of our safety net programs, like you said, well-intentioned, totally agree with you. We've structured some of our safety net programs to have perverse disincentives to work. And I think the benefits cliff is in some ways like the most pernicious of those. So what is a benefit cliff? Basically what happens is if somebody sees an increase in income because they get a raise, get a promotion, and they tick over a certain income threshold, they can lose some in many cases all of a particular benefit. The roughest benefit cliff is childcare, where somebody can see a loss of $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 in childcare. So moms, dads, they're faced with a choice. Do I take, in some cases, it's only a 25-cent raise. In some cases, it might be a $5 an hour raise that is actually going to be economically harmful to my family. So we've seen stories of people actually turning down promotions because it would cost them money. That's wrong.
So Dr. K, with your experience, again, as kind of a conduit to the people who are living this, how would you characterize the benefit cliffs? Is this something that feels like an isolated, once-in-a-while kind of experience, or is this sort of a widespread thing that people in Illinois are facing or fear facing? Does this affect their economic decision-making a lot or a little? What have you kind of seen in your experience?
Well, I'd like to preface that with my limited understanding of the benefits cliff. But what I can say that I think is interesting here is when I hear about that is that it's more of a question of vocation than it is of benefits. So when you get to the benefits cliff, there's a question that I think precedes that, which is one, will this vocational opportunity, what are the possibilities for this vocational opportunity? Have I trained, have I taken all the time that I've taken to get into this position? Is it going to return the value on it that I have actually believed it would produce for me? And so I think what that reveals is that people are eager to work. They're eager to invigorate being able-bodied. I call it able-bodiedness. But they want that able-bodiedness to be able to produce opportunities that actually supersede anything as it relates to a choice of taking more money, whether that's a dollar or $2 an hour, or returning to a particular position that makes them have to continue to suffer through the choice outcomes that have given them, put them in a position where their lives have been divergent, nonlinear, and non-symmetrical or asymmetrical, if you will. So what I'm seeing is that people still want these opportunities, but they want them to be more definitive in terms of what choices that they have vocationally, and rely on the vocation and their aptitudes and their skills to be able to produce the kind of life that they want.
The benefit cliffs, it's something that we're working on here at Sutherland Institute here in Utah as well. But it sounds like at the core of this issue of this disincentive to work, or this perverse incentive, is this lingering question for the individuals facing it of, is it worth it? And Dr. K, you're talking about, well, a vocational opportunity, this training credential, this job, is this actually going to put my family in a better circumstance than we are right now? And same thing, Josh, with the benefit cliff itself. And from my read of it, one of the challenges is it's very complex because there are multiple programs. You mentioned childcare. That there's also, I've heard of stories of Medicaid being one of these. Food stamps and TANF cash assistance may be still present, but not quite as much, especially for cash assistance, just because it's a lower amount. And other things like housing and those kinds of things. But that it's this basic question of if I do this thing, if I take this action, will my family be better off or worse off? Or will our circumstance be about the same? And in that case, is it worth it? Is it worthwhile? And it gets to something that we talked before about sort of the moral language, this idea of the dignity, this sense of human flourishing, that if folks feel like, well, my actions don't actually make my family better off, or they might make us worse off, I gotta believe that's sort of a gut punch to this idea of optimism of human flourishing. So it goes back to this moral case of we have to understand the nature and scope of the problem truly so we can properly fix it. And Josh, from your standpoint, what are some of the things that we should be considering as far as how to fix it? What are some things that you've seen, maybe that you've outlined in your paper, that things that states can do, that the federal government can do? If you could just say, hey, here's where we start, what comes to mind?
The tricky thing about benefits cliffs, well, actually, pause a second and just step back. In terms of the moral language, the benefit cliff is part of a snare net that is an assault on human dignity. And that's why it's so important that we fix things like this. So what can we do civilly about the benefit cliffs? Largely, this seems like a federal problem because it's mostly federal programs that have these steep cliffs. So the sort of unimaginative answer would be, well, look, we need federal reform. And if that happens, that'd be great. I think what we need also is innovation at the state, local, and private level, because even if the federal government is not just to do something, doesn't mean that we stop caring about and advocating for individuals at this level. So there's no reason why states can't create their own programs to smooth that cliff. So essentially bridge programs where someone, say, loses those federal child care benefits, and I think structured the right way, which is to continue to empower people through the dignity of work, structured the right way, can smooth that cliff. There are actually a couple of cool pilot programs that we're studying in a couple of places around the country. We'll have more research on that in the next couple of months that are at least totally worth trying. Maybe they won't work, but these are local cities that are trying to smooth that cliff, and then seeing innovation at the private level too. So an understanding from employers and from NGOs that this is an issue, and creating programs that mean that a $5 raise doesn't cost your family $5,000, $10,000, $15,000.
It seems too that there obviously is an economic connection with this, where again we're talking so much about the moral language just because I think it's compelling, but from the economic standpoint, that the very idea of upward mobility is that as you gain skills or experience, you accept jobs, raises, hours, things like that again provide a better life. You're increasing your earned income, but it has to make sense for you to do that. Have you guys seen anything either there in Illinois or more broadly, whether it's data in the evidence or even just anecdotes of what economic effect does this have, either on the individuals who face this or employers, the economy? And the way I would couch it is sort of in two ways. That from my read of it so far, it seems like there's sort of a couple ways people might experience this. If they're progressing in terms of their earned income, but then if they sort of see a cliff in front of them, say that, well, if I accept this raise, if I take this job, if I work more hours, then I think I will lose a disproportionate amount of benefits, or just an amount that would make this raise or job or hour increase not worthwhile. So I'm going to say no and kind of stay where I'm at. And again, acting rationally, because I'm better off where I am right now for my family. So there are people who are saying no to economic opportunities, but then there are people who say yes and kind of go over the cliff, and on the other end, they think, well, now what do I do? What's your read of how that's playing out in Illinois or elsewhere as far as how it affects economic progress, again, for those families or even for employers?
Well, I really think this is a great conversation right here, especially when we're talking about, it from the perspective of morals. And if we take a step back from morals and look at ethics, I think that really, some of these ethical choices or ethical determinations that really make the morality kind of reduced to what's right and what's wrong. Should people, is it good for people is it good to have benefits or safety net? Is it wrong to partake in it? But when we take a step back and look at the ethical relativism of communities, what's good and right and what's right and wrong, and the choice outcomes that happen there. Now I think we're in the right space in terms of how, as policy and researchers, policymakers and researchers, how do we determine what is ethically and morally? Do we have the ethical and moral competence in mind with regards to the communities that we're serving? How does that look on the ground? So our decisions should be ethical solutions that use the morals of a community, moral understandings in the communities in terms of their decision makings that help to guide us in terms of making things more and more effective. So I think that we're having the right conversations, and I know we can't solve it here, but I think that that's something that has to be talked about.
Well, I think one of the things that I'll draw from what you just said, Dr. K, is this need for ongoing dialogue and across the board. I mean, there are left of center, right of center, centrist elected officials, community leaders, think tanks, policy organizations. This goes back to Josh, I think your point of this idea of a consensus approach around some of these high level principles. And you, in your paper, you outline them as sort of 7 solutions, and which I think makes sense. I would also even describe them as sort of 7 guiding principles that as long as we feel like whatever we're crafting, the details of a policy can meet with these principles, that's how you're going to, again, draw broad consensus. And as we wrap up, we've got just a couple minutes left. I want to make sure we don't leave the conversation without explaining a little bit more, Dr. K, about the Center for Poverty Solutions, because we've alluded to it throughout this discussion, but I think there's something unique about what you're doing that just as an outsider seems like a very important bridge, if you will, between the policy experts, the academic folks who research and talk about these issues, and the on-the-ground experiences of real Americans who are facing this. Can you talk about why that connection is so important, that what sounds really good on paper, we need to filter through the lens of lived experience, and both of those things together can help inform a better approach. But what's impactful or unique about what you're doing with the Center for Poverty Solutions that maybe other states should consider?
And I do believe this is something that is replicable, but it all starts with Matt Protke, our CEO, who came up with the concept of the Center for Poverty Solutions. And when you talk to Matt, immediately what you discern is his heart posture as it relates to humanity, as it relates to solutions that are impacting the vitality and of communities. And so I think that authenticity starts with that. You have to be willing to talk to people who don't share your same language experience and begin to listen. And so the number one thing that we've done here at the beginning was bring people in and listen to them, listen to their positions, listen to how they are approaching concepts, what their epistemic frameworks are, if you will. And I have to give kudos to Josh. I think that his principles that he's set up resonate with people, but you take the principles to them and let them determine their relevance, and let them determine how they might think about them, and so that you can have the exchange that you need to have. So I think that we're authentically embedded in the communities. We go to them, they come to us. And so out of that, that's 2 things that we're doing going forward is our Center for Poverty Solutions Civic and Service Incubator, as well as our creating a fellow that comes out of this that is community-based, community-oriented, that has been from being a participant in a program to graduating that program, working for that program, and now they move on to their own entrepreneurial endeavors. as well as a policy advisory group. We champion the people in that regard and want to make sure that we give the opportunity, whether you're left leaning or right leaning, to come into take these seemingly asymmetrical conversations, bring them in, and understand that we're all solving for the same thing and for the same community.
100%. And to tie things up, Josh, this sounds a lot to me like the sort of the makings of a movement, or rather refreshing the movement, the opportunity movement in the United States, for lack of a better term, this idea of reviving and revitalizing the American dream. That this sounds like all of that. How do we take this, and particularly for our listeners, if they hear this and say, yes, this sounds great, I'm on board, sign me up. What do I do now? How do I help? What are the messages that we all need to articulate across the political spectrum, and how do we articulate those messages such that we can have a broad coalition that unites around these principles, that it can become a consensus movement of getting that I'm going to find the stat, the 30-something% number you referenced at the beginning of, barely more than a third of Americans who believe in the American dream. How do we mobilize a coalition, a movement, to get that number back up to where it should be? What's some takeaways for us?
Yeah, so I think the question is, how do we persuade about the power of these ideas? And I think really top level, it's intentionality, yes, and optimism. It's talking about opportunity, empowerment, the pursuit of happiness. And I think specifically having a better appreciation for the psychology of persuasion. I think that's a place where our movement sometimes falls a little bit short, that we do phenomenal research, right? You have these white papers, and we have these articles and amazing data and just, stuff that's absolutely phenomenal. It's like, okay, well, then what? Because that is necessary and in no way sufficient. So I would say that there are 3 growth areas for us to be more persuasive. The first is to understand, and this is not me talking, this is just like neuroscientists and psychologists, that we human beings feel first, and then we reason. So yes, that logic and reason are foundational. And what do you want people to feel? So second thing, how do you do that? We need to make the moral case for things. So when we talk about how 17.2% of Chicagoans, 450,000 people, suffer through poverty, already talking about not just in poverty, but they suffer through it, that's moral language. And then, period, well, so what? Is it a question mark? Exclamation point? No, you have to say, that's wrong, that's unjust, that's unfair, because it is. So we need to punctuate what we say with moral language, and even in there, they're not just in poverty, they suffer through it. And then we need stories with the right heroes. And a lot of times we don't tell stories, and when we do, we often have the wrong heroes. Let me give you an example. A lot of people who are in this poverty empowerment opportunity space, they talk about lifting people out of poverty. That's the wrong hero, because the hero then is the policy professional who is producing good policies to fix the problem. And the hero has to be those people who are empowered to rise out of poverty. So we need to tell stories, and we need to get the heroes right. I mentioned earlier my family history, right? My heroes are my mom and my grandmother, because how did they get out of poverty? Because they were dirt freaking poor, man. Work. My grandmother never took a penny of government assistance. She worked and worked, and my mom worked 2 jobs to put me through Catholic school. Amazing work, right? And they're my heroes. I'm not the hero of any story. They are my heroes. So I think we need to get the heroes right. I think that's one thing that our Center for Poverty Solutions points to real opportunities is the heroes are people, our partners, like people at IC Stars, and you can see our partners on our website. These are the heroes. Tell their stories because they're real.
Well, Josh and Dr. K, this has been a phenomenal conversation. I could talk for hours with you guys about this stuff, and I'm sure we'll have some follow-up conversations about all of this. But just want to thank you both again for spending your time with us, lending some of your expertise and sharing some of the good work you're doing in Illinois, so we can explore how that impacts what we do in Utah and in all other states to try and make the American dream more reachable for more Americans. So thank you both for your time and expertise.
Thank you.
Nick, thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Again, thanks to that's Josh Bandoch and Eddie Kornegay of the Illinois Policy Institute and the Center for Poverty Solutions there at IPI. Very appreciative of their time. We're going to take one more final break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, there's just a few notes that I captured from our conversation with Josh and Dr. K from the Illinois Policy Institute about poverty and upward mobility, and what I think represents the ingredients for a better vision for how to address poverty and help more and more people feel like they're really partaking of the American dream. And the main takeaway to me is that I think it's important that we shift our approach away from just an idea of, well, we need to sort of reach down and lift up folks in poverty, and instead talk about it in language like we need to empower them through education and work opportunities, but then bring with it policy reforms that can clear the path in front of them, clear away any barriers to work or disincentives in the various public policies that we have. Good example of that, as we discussed, is some important safety net reform, in particular in the realm of benefit cliffs, so we make sure there are not any disincentives to work built into our safety net system. Not only is this economically advantageous because it will lead to more upward mobility and self-sufficiency and help our economy as a whole, but it's also the morally right thing to do, which is an important part of the message from our friends at Illinois Policy as well. Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode and that you feel better equipped to discuss and defend some of the issues we talked about today. If you want to access more of Defending Ideas, please visit defendingideas.org. You can find this podcast on all the major providers. Wherever you get your shows, just search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel and click the little bell icon in the corner so you can get notified each time a new episode drops. You can find all of that and more at defendingideas.org. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute to help facilitate more conversations like this one, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. That will do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. Thanks so much for being with us. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.